The sun burned low over the fields of Iowa, turning every blade of wheat into gold. From a distance, it could have been any other American summer evening. A tractor idling by the barn, children chasing each other with tin pails, the smell of bread cooling on windowsills. But down the dirt road came a sound that didn't belong, the low growl of army trucks, engines grumbling like tired beasts. As dust rose behind them, the silhouettes in the back became clear. Men in plain khaki, their faces marked with the stillness of defeat. German prisoners of war, hundreds of them rolling into America's heartland. No one quite knew what to expect. The locals had read headlines about the men who had marched through Poland, France, and North Africa. Men who had once worn the Iron Cross. Men who had sworn loyalty to Hitler. To see them now, dusty and quiet, sitting shoulder to shoulder under guard, felt unreal. A few farmers stood by the fence as the convoy passed. "Those are generals?" one asked. "Some of them," said a sergeant. "They'll be picking corn by next week." The United States by 1944 held over 400,000 German prisoners scattered across 700 camps from Maine to California. The great war machine that had once terrorized Europe now found itself housed beside pastures and silos. With most able-bodied American men overseas, the War Department allowed the prisoners to work local farms, a practical solution cloaked in the logic of the Geneva Convention. Yet to many it still felt impossible. The idea that men who once commanded armies could now be paid to harvest potatoes for American families. Among the first to arrive that week was General Friedrich von Broich, a tall, weathered man in his early 50s. His hands still bore the faint tan lines where his uniform gloves had once ended. When he stepped off the truck at Camp Algona, his boots sank into mud that smelled of wheat and manure. He looked around. Rows of wooden barracks, an American flag waving lazily above the gate. Guards who looked barely old enough to shave. For a man raised on Prussian discipline, it was almost insulting. Yet the camp was orderly, the food edible, and the guards polite. He'd expected humiliation. Instead, he was handed a bar of soap and a clean bed. At dawn the next morning, the prisoners were driven to nearby farms. The fields stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed too wide, too honest. For men who had seen Africa's dust and Russia's frost, this place felt unreal, a land untouched by war. Von Broich found himself working beside an American named Henry McCall, a farmer in his 40s whose son was fighting in France. Their words stumbled through broken English and hesitant German, but over the hours something human began to bridge the silence. McCall offered water from his canteen. The general hesitated, then took it. Their eyes met, two men sweating under the same sun. At noon, the prisoners rested under an oak tree. They opened their ration tins and ate in silence, watched by distant children from the farmhouse porch. McCall's wife, Margaret, stood at the doorway with a pie in her hands, uncertain. Her husband had told her these men were dangerous, but they didn't look dangerous. They looked tired, hollow-eyed, sunburnt, stripped of everything but dignity. When McCall came in for lunch, she whispered, "Shouldn't we offer them something?" He frowned. "They're prisoners." Then softer. "But they're men, I suppose." That Sunday after church, Margaret made a decision that startled the whole town. She invited two German prisoners, one a general, one a young corporal, to join their family for dinner. A guard accompanied them, rifle slung politely over his shoulder, though he looked more embarrassed than cautious. The prisoners sat stiffly at the table, hands folded, unsure if this was a test or a trick. The smell of roasted chicken filled the small farmhouse. The children stared wide-eyed, whispering. Margaret set down the dishes as if serving ghosts. The meal began in uneasy quiet. McCall said grace, his voice low but steady. "Lord, bless this food and those who eat it, even our enemies, if you will." The general bowed his head. When he lifted it again, his eyes glistened. "Danke," he said softly. They ate slowly, cautiously, the way men do when they aren't sure they deserve what's on their plate. The young corporal, barely 20, smiled at the youngest McCall boy, who shyly passed him the butter. For the first time in months, the prisoners tasted real bread, not camp rations. The crust was warm, the air filled with the scent of home. After dinner, the general stood. "Madam," he said in careful English, "you have shown us more honor than war ever could." Margaret only nodded, unsure what to say. When the guard escorted them back, she watched them go through the window, two silhouettes vanishing into dusk, their steps slow, almost reverent. Word of that meal spread quickly. Some neighbors disapproved. "My boy died fighting them," one man said. "And she's feeding them?" But others couldn't help but feel something stir, a quiet curiosity about what mercy might look like even in wartime. Over the next weeks, more farmers began offering small kindnesses, an extra loaf, a few cigarettes, a handshake across the fence. What began as a single dinner turned into something larger, a quiet defiance of hatred. Von Broich, once a proud general of the Afrika Korps, found himself changed in ways he couldn't explain. At night, he sat on his bunk, writing in his journal. "These Americans," he wrote, "fight with power, yet treat with gentleness. We were told they were merchants of greed. I find them merchants of decency." He folded the page carefully as though it might outlast him. By autumn, the camp had become almost a village of its own. The guards trusted the men enough to let them sing at night, German folk songs that drifted across the fields. Sometimes the farmers joined in, humming along to melodies they didn't understand. The war still raged across oceans, but here, in this small corner of Iowa, something rare was happening. Enemies learning the weight of peace before peace had even been declared. One evening, as the sky turned crimson over the wheat fields, McCall and the general stood side by side, watching crows spiral above the barn. "Strange, isn't it?" McCall said. "How men can fight over the same piece of earth and still both love it." The general nodded. "Perhaps we fought because we both loved it too much." Neither spoke again. The sound of crickets rose around them, steady, endless. When winter came, the trucks returned to collect the prisoners for transfer. The ground was frozen, the fields bare. As von Broich climbed into the truck bed, Margaret appeared with a parcel wrapped in cloth. Bread, apples, a small note. "For your journey," she said. He removed his cap and bowed his head. "This," he said quietly, "I will remember longer than any victory." As the convoy rolled away, snow began to fall, soft, soundless, covering the tracks behind them. McCall watched until the trucks vanished beyond the trees. In his heart, he couldn't decide whether he had just shown mercy to an enemy or shared a table with a friend. He turned back toward the house where the dinner plates still waited to be washed. On the table lay the general's napkin, folded neatly, untouched, and beneath it a single silver button from a uniform long since taken away. The frost came early that winter, curling across the camp fences like white lace. Inside the barbed wire perimeter, the German prisoners awoke to the distant toll of an American church bell. The sound carried over the frozen fields, solemn and clear. For many, it was a sound they hadn't heard since before the war, a reminder of home, of civility, of mornings that once began with coffee and quiet, not gunfire. General von Broich stood by the window of the barracks, breath fogging the glass. "Even their bells," he murmured, "sound unafraid." The camp had settled into its strange rhythm. Each day began with roll call, followed by work assignments in the surrounding farms. The guards, mostly young National Guard recruits, had stopped treating the Germans like caged beasts. They were polite, even cordial, sometimes joking in broken phrases. In time, the lines between captor and captive began to blur. The war, though raging oceans away, felt distant here, muffled beneath the wind and the endless labor of the fields. One morning, as the prisoners loaded sacks of grain onto a wagon, an older farmer named Walter Grady rode up in his pickup. His eyes were the color of river stones, his body bent by years of work. His son had been killed in Italy only 6 months earlier, yet his voice was calm. "Need a few men to help fix the fence down by the creek," he told the guard. The officer hesitated. "They're generals, Mr. Grady." The farmer shrugged. "Fence don't care who broke it. Only cares who'll mend it." The men followed him down a dirt path to the frozen water's edge. As they worked, the farmer's hammer echoed through the air like a heartbeat. When one of the prisoners, a corporal named Weber, cut his palm on a nail, Grady wordlessly tore a strip from his own flannel sleeve and wrapped it tight. The young man stared, startled. "You help enemy?" he asked haltingly. Grady kept pounding the post. "Son, I just help whoever's bleeding on my land." In the evenings, the camp mess hall glowed with yellow light. The prisoners sat in long rows, eating quietly, their trays filled with the same stew the guards ate, potatoes, beans, the occasional slice of meat. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't cruelty either. Many of the officers whispered among themselves that this treatment was a trick, some clever American form of psychological warfare. Others began to suspect something far more dangerous, sincerity. Letters home were heavily censored, but bits of truth still slipped through. In one surviving note, a German lieutenant wrote, "They give us coffee every morning. Coffee, even when their own ration books run short. I do not understand this country." Another wrote, "I fear their kindness more than their weapons." Christmas approached, and the small Iowa town prepared for it with quiet determination. The local church strung pine garlands and placed candles along its windowsills. Pastor Raymond Ellis, a man known for his stern sermons, made a decision that divided his congregation. He invited a small group of POWs to attend the midnight service. "Christ didn't die for one side only," he said from the pulpit. Some families walked out. Others stayed curious. On that cold December night, the church filled with the mingled smell of wool coats and candle wax. The German prisoners entered in silence, escorted by a single guard who leaned his rifle against the wall and removed his hat. They sat in the back pews, heads bowed. When the organ began to play Silent Night, a few of the Germans softly joined in, their accent shaping the melody into something achingly familiar. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The congregation faltered, then slowly followed. For a brief, fragile moment, language and war disappeared. Only the song remained. General von Broik felt something in his chest unclench. He glanced at the farmer's daughter, Margaret McCall's little girl, sitting near the front pew, her small hand clutching a hymn book. When their eyes met, she smiled shyly. He looked away quickly, ashamed of how deeply the gesture pierced him. Outside, after the service, snow fell in soft spirals. The townspeople offered the prisoners cups of cocoa, and one old woman pressed knitted gloves into a young man's hands, muttering, "Your fingers look colder than mine." The guards did not stop her. They only watched, silent, as the prisoners hesitated between pride and gratitude before murmuring, "Danke." But not everyone approved. The next morning, an unsigned letter appeared on Pastor Ellis's doorstep. "They killed our boys. You let them into God's house. Shame." He burned the paper in his fireplace, but the words lingered in his mind. Mercy, he thought, was always the hardest sermon to preach. For the prisoners, the Americans' decency began to gnaw at something deeper than hunger. It unsettled their beliefs. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a place of moral decay, chaos, and greed. Yet here they saw order, generosity, and respect. It was not the America of their lectures. It was an America that fed its enemies and invited them to church. "It is easier," von Broik wrote in his journal, "to hate a man who strikes you than one who offers you his hand." Weeks turned into months. The guards started playing baseball in the open yard, and sometimes they invited the prisoners to join. The sight was almost comical. A German general swinging at a pitch, missing entirely, and grinning at the laughter of his captors. "He plays like my uncle," one guard joked. The general tipped his cap. "Your uncle," he replied, "must have been a fine soldier." For a heartbeat, everyone laughed. In that sound, the war felt smaller. Still, an undercurrent of guilt flowed beneath the peace. Some guards wrestled with it in silence. Private Tom Henderson, only 19, wrote in his diary, "I shake hands with men my brother may be killing somewhere over there. I don't know what's right anymore." His confusion mirrored that of many Americans who wanted to be kind but feared betraying the memory of their own dead. By early spring, the snow melted, revealing green shoots in the fields. The prisoners returned to the farms, this time with less fear, more familiarity. Children waved to them from porches. A farmer's wife left baskets of apples by the road. Yet the war still raged in Europe. Battles they could neither fight nor forget. News of bombed German cities reached them through guarded whispers. The proud men who once gave orders now sat in barns weeping quietly over rumors of lost families. One afternoon, as the prisoners repaired a broken plow, a mail truck arrived at the camp. Among the letters was one addressed to the German officer who fixed our roof. Inside was a simple note in pencil. "You may have fought against us, but you worked beside us. God bless you." There was no signature. The general folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, beside the silver button he'd kept since the day he left McCall's farm. That night he walked to the edge of the camp fence. Beyond it, the distant lights of farmhouses shimmered like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere out there, the same families who once feared him were saying their prayers. He placed his hand on the cold wire, feeling the current hum faintly beneath his palm. "We built these lines to keep enemies apart," he whispered to himself. But somehow kindness crossed them first. The wind carried his words away, leaving only the creak of the fence in the dark. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the war thundered on. But here, amid the frost and fields of Iowa, its echo felt quieter than mercy. By the spring of 1945, the fields of Iowa were alive again. The snow had vanished, replaced by the scent of wet soil and apple blossoms. Yet within the camp fences, the air felt heavy. The war in Europe was reaching its brutal end, and the radios in the guardhouse hummed with reports of collapse. Berlin under siege, Hitler hidden in his bunker, entire armies surrendering. The German prisoners gathered each evening beneath the barracks light, listening in silence. For men who had once lived by certainty, orders, rank, obedience, their world now stood on trial. General von Broik sat at a rough wooden table, hands folded, the newspaper before him trembling faintly in the draft. "Unconditional surrender," he read aloud, his voice distant. Around him, the younger officers stared as though the words themselves were a verdict. One muttered, "So it ends." Another whispered, "Or begins." No one replied. Outside, the camp loudspeaker called for evening roll, but the men did not move. For the first time, they had nowhere to report to, no flag to salute. The Americans handled the news quietly. There were no jeers, no celebrations inside the camp. The guards, many of whom had come to know the prisoners by name, simply looked at them differently. as if seeing them not as enemies, but as men finally stripped of illusion. Private Tom Henderson, now 19 but aged by war, offered a cigarette to one of the Germans through the fence. "Guess it's over," he said. The officer accepted it with a small nod. "For you," he answered. "For us it is only judgment." That judgment came swiftly. The U.S. Army began preparations for the repatriation of prisoners, but before release came reckoning. The War Department had begun interviewing captured officers for intelligence, partly for information, partly to understand what had driven an entire nation to madness. Some of those interrogations happened quietly in places like Fort Hunt, Virginia, P.O. Box 1142, a facility so secret its name was never spoken aloud. But even in small camps like Algona, interviews were conducted with precision and civility. When von Broich was summoned, he expected humiliation. Instead, the American officer who greeted him extended his hand. "General, thank you for coming," he said politely, gesturing toward a chair. "We're not here to accuse you. We're here to understand." That word, understand, startled him. For years, understanding had been irrelevant to war. Orders mattered, not motives. Yet now, sitting across from a man half his age, he felt as though he were being asked to account for his soul. The questions began simply. "Did you know about the camps? About the executions?" The general's jaw tightened. "I commanded soldiers, not police. I fought by the rules of war." The American didn't raise his voice. "And if those rules were broken above you?" A pause. "Then I failed to see it soon enough." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed something raw. Doubt. Perhaps even guilt. For the first time, the old Prussian code of obedience seemed too narrow to contain the weight of conscience. That night the general couldn't sleep. In the barracks, the men whispered of what might await them in Germany. Tribunals, hunger, ruins. Some still clung to the myth of honor, insisting they had fought for country, not ideology. Others admitted privately that the line between the two had long since blurred. The younger prisoners watched their leaders wrestle with truths that could no longer be denied. The next morning, von Broich went to the camp chapel, a small wooden hut the prisoners had built themselves. On its walls hung a crude cross carved from scrap lumber. A few men were kneeling inside, heads bowed. One was the young Corporal Weber, whose hand had once been bandaged by an American farmer. "Herr General," he said softly, "may I ask you something?" The older man nodded. "Do you think we are forgiven?" The general's breath caught. "Forgiven?" he repeated. "By whom?" Weber hesitated. "By God, by them, by anyone." For a long moment von Broich said nothing. Then he looked toward the open door, where the wind stirred the American flag outside. "Forgiveness," he said slowly, "is something we do not command. It is something we must earn." Meanwhile, in town, small acts of reconciliation continued in quiet defiance of bitterness. The McCalls, who had once shared dinner with the general, sent a basket of fresh bread and apples to the camp on Easter morning. Attached was a note written in Margaret's careful hand. "War ends, but hunger never should." The prisoners read it again and again, passing it from man to man like a relic. Some laughed softly. Others wiped their eyes. At evening muster, an American chaplain visited the camp to read aloud a message from President Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman. "This war," he said, "was not against a people, but against a creed that denied the dignity of man." The words hung in the air like a sentence and a blessing at once. The general stood among his men, head bowed, realizing that the Americans had fought not only to defeat Germany, but to defend an idea, one that had now reached him, even through chains. Later that week, a group of prisoners were invited to attend a town meeting, where local farmers and soldiers' families gathered to discuss post-war recovery. It was controversial. Some protested that the Germans should not be welcomed beyond the fences, but others insisted it was right. When von Broich stepped into the town hall, the room fell silent. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Then an old man in the front row, his sleeves rolled up and hands scarred from decades of work, stood and said simply, "You helped us harvest our fields. Tonight we return the favor. We help you remember you're still men." The meeting ended with an awkward but genuine applause. Outside, the general paused beneath the flagpole, gazing at the stars. "Strange," he said to the guard beside him, "how your victory has no hatred in it." The young guard smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why it's victory at all." As the weeks passed, the camp began to change. The barbed wire rusted, the guards grew fewer, and the prisoners were allowed to walk farther into the fields without escort. The local children would wave as they passed, and sometimes the Germans waved back. A kind of peace, tentative, fragile, but real, settled over the place. Yet not all found comfort in it. For some, the silence of conscience was louder than any prison bell. One evening, von Broich sat outside his barracks, the silver button Margaret had once given him resting in his palm. The sky was turning violet, the horizon burning with the last light of day. Weber approached quietly. "They say we may go home soon," he said. The general nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on the button. "Home," he murmured. "Yes, but what is left of it?" From the guardhouse radio came a faint broadcast, the announcement of the Nuremberg trials. Names of generals, ministers, and field marshals filled the air like ghosts being summoned. The prisoners listened in silence, each aware that history had opened its court, and that conscience would be the final witness. Von Broich closed his hand over the button and looked toward the fields that had once seemed endless. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the true war begins when the guns fall silent." The wind rustled through the fence, carrying the echo of faraway bells. Somewhere beyond the wire, the first fireflies of summer blinked to life, small fragile lights, like verdicts or hopes, hovering over the darkness. The trains came for them in early summer. The war was over, the flags of surrender folded and buried, and now the prisoners would return to a Germany they no longer recognized. At dawn, the camp stirred with uneasy quiet. The barracks were stripped bare, the bunks empty except for a few forgotten books and hand-carved trinkets. General von Broich stood at the edge of the yard, coat folded neatly over his arm, the silver button in his pocket pressing like a heartbeat against his hand. Around him the men waited, some smiling faintly, others pale with dread. Going home was supposed to mean freedom, yet it felt more like exile. Outside the fence, the American farmers had gathered, hats in hand. They came not to gloat, but to say goodbye. For nearly 2 years, these prisoners had labored in their fields, mended their fences, and shared their harvests. Now they were leaving as something else, no longer enemies, not yet friends, but something painfully human in between. Margaret McCall was among them, holding a basket of bread wrapped in linen. Her husband, Henry, stood beside her, his face sunburned and still. When the general's eyes met hers, she stepped forward through the line of guards and held out the basket. "You should have food for the journey," she said softly. "Germany's starving." He hesitated, then took it, bowing his head. "You feed us even now," he murmured. "Is there no end to your mercy?" Henry gave a faint smile. "War's over. We might as well start acting like it." The trucks arrived soon after. Olive green, dust-covered, carrying Hanks, New York, they were processed for departure. Rows of ships waited at the harbor, their gray hulls glinting in sunlight. The air smelled of salt and diesel, of home and uncertainty. On the dock, American officers handed each man a sealed envelope marked "Discharge." Inside were identification papers, a summary of conduct and, astonishingly, a small amount of money, earned from months of farm labor. Von Broich read the final line aloud. "Treatment exemplary. Behavior honorable." He closed his eyes. "Exemplary," he whispered. "They conquered us and still call us honorable." That evening, before boarding, the prisoners were allowed to walk the docks freely. A group of American sailors played jazz from a portable radio. One of them, seeing the Germans lingering nearby, called out, "You boys ever heard Duke Ellington?" The prisoners shook their heads. "Well, you're hearing him now," the sailor laughed, turning up the volume. The music drifted over the water, strange and jubilant. Von Broich felt something stir in him, an ache for joy for a world unscarred by war. "They even fight sadness with rhythm," he said. When the ship finally sailed, the coastline of America faded behind a veil of mist. The general leaned on the railing, the basket of bread still untouched beside him. He broke off a piece and handed it to the corporal. "From Mrs. McCall," he said. "She baked this with her own hands." The young man hesitated. "Sir, why do they do it?" "After all we've done?" Von Broich watched the gulls wheel over the water. "Because they can," he said quietly. "That is what makes them free." Days later, the ship docked in Le Havre, France. The port was a skeleton of twisted cranes and shattered warehouses. Beyond it lay the wasteland that had once been Europe. The men disembarked under gray skies, each carrying what little they owned. Allied officers processed them swiftly. Names checked, uniforms confiscated, directions barked in a dozen accents. Men who had seen too much and understood too little. As the prisoners climbed aboard, they passed through a corridor of silence. A few Americans offered handshakes. Others nodded stiffly, torn between forgiveness and memory. Private Henderson saluted von Broich one last time. "Safe travels, General," he said. The older man returned the salute, though his voice broke when he answered. "And peace to your people, young man. Guard it well. It is a rarer thing than victory." The convoy moved east, rattling past miles of corn and quiet towns. Through the slats of the truck, the prisoners watched America slide by. White church steeples, water towers, baseball fields filled with shouting children. The general thought of his homeland, its cities in ruins, its people walking among ashes. The contrast was unbearable. "We fought to preserve order," he said to no one in particular. But it seems we destroyed it while they kept it alive. The corporal beside him nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. Maybe that's why they won, sir. When they reached the rail station, a Red Cross unit awaited them with food and medical checks. A young American nurse handed each man a small parcel wrapped in paper, sandwiches, an apple, a bar of soap. When von Broich opened his, a folded note fell out. In delicate handwriting it read, "The world begins again when mercy is remembered." He looked around for the writer, but the nurse had already moved down the line. The train clattered north through the plains, then east toward the Atlantic coast. Along the way, they passed through towns where children waved from platforms, curious and unafraid. Some even shouted, "Auf Wiedersehen," words learned from the very men who had once been their country's enemies. To von Broich, it felt surreal, almost sacred. He found himself humming an old hymn beneath his breath, a tune the Iowa church choir had sung on Christmas Eve. The corporal joined in softly. For a moment, the rumble of wheels became a kind of rhythm, the song carrying over the fields like a confession. At Camp von Broich was assigned to a repatriation camp near Frankfurt, but as he stepped onto the train platform, he paused. The bread from Iowa was still in his pack, miraculously unspoiled. He handed it to a starving child who stood barefoot by the tracks. The boy's mother tried to refuse, but he pressed it into her hands. "It was given to me," he said. "Now it is yours." When he finally reached Germany, he found his hometown in ruins, church spires collapsed, streets lined with rubble, silence where life used to be. In what had been his father's study, only a cracked portrait remained. He set down his suitcase and stared at the empty space. The weight of years of pride, of war, settled upon him like dust. And then, in a gesture that surprised even himself, he placed the silver button on the mantelpiece beside the broken frame. "You taught me more," he whispered, "than any victory ever did." Months later, as West Germany began its slow rebirth, a letter arrived at the McCall farm in Iowa. It was written in careful English, ink smudged by travel. "Your kindness," it read, "was not forgotten. You gave us back our humanity before our country could. If there is a God, he wore your hands that day." It was signed simply F. von Broich. Margaret read it aloud at the dinner table, her voice trembling. Her husband nodded quietly. "Guess mercy travels faster than armies," he said. She smiled faintly. "And lasts longer." That evening, as the sun dipped beyond the fields, Henry McCall stood on the porch gazing at the horizon where the sky turned to gold. "Strange thing," he murmured. "The war ended years ago, but I think that supper we shared might have done more than the guns ever could." Inside, Margaret placed the letter beside the family Bible. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wheat swayed in the warm wind, whispering softly, like distant voices calling across the ocean, carrying the memory of mercy home.